Welcome to Psychology of the DAF. We are on DAF Kuf Yud Zayin 117. We're going to look at a selection that is on Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, that is on 117b. This selection here is talking about making a bracha on bread, and we find that Rabbi Zeira on Shabbos would make a bracha on bread and break off from the loaf a large amount, an amount for his whole meal. And Ravina asks Rav Ashi about this practice. Does this not appear like gluttony to break off such a large piece? And Rav Ashi answers that since during the week Rav Zeira does not behave that way, and he only does it on Shabbos, it does not appear as gluttony. The Mefarshim say that, Adarabba, he's showing chibuv mitzvah, he's showing chavivus, a love for the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos and being Mechabed Shabbos, and so he breaks off an amount of bread that's much larger than customary, the amount of bread he'd used for the whole meal, and it's showing love for the mitzvah, and it does not give the impression of gluttony. Now, just by the way, a side point, but you find sometimes in restaurants, by the Netilas Yadayim station, small pieces of bread, and people make a bracha on that bread over there, presumably out of a chumrah to not have a long hefsek between your Netilas Yadayim and your hamotzi, i.e. the amount of time it takes to go back to your seat, or perhaps because maybe the busboy didn't bring bread yet to the table. The interesting thing is that particular chumrah really disrupts a much more important inyan, which is to make a bracha on a mechubedika piece. It's considered kavod a bracha to hold a shalem, or at least a chashiv piece of bread in your hands when you make a bracha. So if you're asking me, the more important chumrah to adhere to for kavod a bracha and to arouse a state of appreciation and dvekus, which is really what the whole point of it is before you make a bracha, is to go back to your seat, because it's not such a big deal to have a short hefsek between the bracha Netilas Yadayim and hamotzi, because the real problem is the hefsek between hamotzi and the bread. So you should go back to your seat, get your pita or piece of bread or something, hold it with all 10 fingers, and make the bracha there. Anyway, that's a side point. But what we're seeing from this Gemara is an interesting idea, which is that even though ordinarily the same behavior that would be perceived as gluttony, as being a Baal Taiva, as being a hedonist, when it's done only on Shabbos for the sake of enjoying Shabbos, now obviously you're also going to enjoy the bread, but it's done only on Shabbos for the sake of enjoying Shabbos, and during the week one's practice is to be much more humble. It's not considered gluttony, and it's considered kavod Shabbos. And if you look at the Lashon of Shulchan Aruch and Orach Chaim, Siman Kuf Samach Zayin 167, he says that one should not break off a small piece when you make a bracha, because that looks like you're cheap. One should neither not break off too big a piece, because that makes one look like a glutton. Mishnah Berurah over there in Sifkat and Yud Beis, in Article 12, says, but on Shabbos it does not appear like gluttony. B'Shabbos lo mechsi karav tanusa demishum chibuv sudas Shabbos hu ose laharbos b'sauda. So, because you're doing it for the love of the mitzvah of Shabbos. And from here we see an interesting point, which is that there are times that when one does an eating with gusto and with taiva, if it's done to honor a mitzvah, particularly in this case we see the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos, then that's not considered gluttony, even though to a certain extent there is real enjoyment. But we also see a Rashi in Psachim, Amdaf Tzadik Tesam at Beis. Rashi in Psachim talks about the idea that we don't have matzah on Erev Pesach, and the general belief is to eat it with te'avon. That the Gemara says we're supposed to do that so that we should have a desire. But Rashi adds something very interesting. Rashi says, Kedei sheyochol matzah shel mitzvah l'te'avon mishum hidur mitzvah. So Rashi is learning eating the matzah with gusto, wanting to eat the matzah, is not just pshat that it's like honoring that it's honoring Pesach honoring the mitzvah, but he considers it hidur mitzvah. He considers it to be just like you're going to buy a fancy esrog or put decorations in your sukkah. He considers desire for the matzah, a desire, a hunger for the matzah, to be itself a hidur mitzvah, which is a fascinating chiddush. And from here, I would like to share with you something original that I do not believe I have seen anywhere else, something original that I thought of, which is you find in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Reish Mem, which is where Shulchan Aruch discusses the various modesty codes and principles about sexual relations. And over there, Shulchan Aruch stresses the importance of, at least on the man's part, to minimize the amount of pleasure and to moderate the pleasure. Now, this part of Shulchan Aruch is complicated, halacha l'maisa, how to apply it, because clearly people who try to attempt this, who are not on that madrega, are in a situation of tafasta b'mruba lo tafasta. They might end up in a situation of chumra dasid lidei kula. But let's just talk about the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch does recommend, as much as possible, for a man, not a woman, because it's a mitzvah to give a woman pleasure, but for a man to limit the amount of pleasure he's supposed to experience. And then the Shulchan Aruch goes into various motivations. He's based on the Bali Nefesh of the Ravid, and there's different motivations. The highest motivation is for the mitzvah, to have children, and then there are lower motivations, and the final motivation is if one just feels a strong desire, to satisfy that desire in order to prevent from doing sin. And the Ramah is quick to point out that that also is a mitzvah, but again, Shulchan Aruch stresses that one should oftentimes moderate their desire and seek other solutions. Again, halacha l'maisa, it's very complicated. One really needs to talk to a trusted Rebbe and Madrich about how to apply these principles, because to try to abstain in the area of permitted oftentimes creates more problems. And because these things have to do with tznius, it's not questions that people often ask or feel comfortable asking, and it leads to a lot of guilt and confusion. There's actually a separate YouTube channel that you could listen to called the Chassan and Kala Shmooze You Wish You Had But Never Got, where I talk about this in great length. Actually, Baruch Hashem, 31 different shiurim on the topic. But over here, I'll just say that, be that as it may, each person, according to their madrega, there is a concept that one should in some way moderate their sexual desire, however you want to apply it. That it's not a free-for-all according to the Torah, even though technically it's permitted, and the Ramah points that out in Siman Chaf Hey and Even Ezer, that Kol Masha Adam Rotza Lasos Ishta Osa, a person could really, as long as it's adhering to Taras Mishpacha and it's with one's own spouse, people as consenting adults are free to engage in whatever they want with all that. But really, the right way to do it is, in some way, one shouldn't be a free-for-all. There should be a certain dignity, a certain moderation when it comes to sexual practices. I stress, perhaps each person has to determine what's the appropriate degree of moderation, but some moderation. But here's where the Chiddush comes in. In Hilchos Shabbos, in Perek Lamed, Halach Yadal, the Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos, chapter 30, article 14, mentions that marital relations is one of the ongim of Shabbos, is one of the delights of Shabbos. So and that's why there's actually a custom for Tamid Chachamim, which in the Litvish world does not follow. The disciple says he's supposed to be Mekayim Ona twice a week. That means that it should not only be from Shabbos to Shabbos, but in the time of the Gemara, and also amongst some other groups of Jews, certain Hasidim have this practice that the real mitzvah is only every Friday night. But the point is, regardless of how many other times you do it, there's a special mitzvah that everybody agrees to. That's the Rambam. There's a mitzvah to have relations on Friday night, and that's considered Oneg Shabbos. So, if we were to apply this principle, we might be able to say that since we saw that when it came to eating of the bread, we saw that the rules of Rav Tanufasa, the rules of gluttony, are suspended because if one's practice is normally to be humble and modest, On Shabbos, one can break off a much larger piece of bread and, for the sake of Onik Shabbos, eat it with gusto. And you can learn, according to Rashi in Psachim, it's even a hidur mitzvah. One might argue that whoever normally is more restrained and more abstaining and more moderating in their sexual practices, perhaps because it's a mitzvah of Onik Shabbos on Shabbos, perhaps one should be less restrained. Those are my thoughts for today.